Good afternoon, Garland Nixon here. I'm here with Dr. Radhika Desai, and she is a professor, she is an author and a good friend, and we got a lot to talk about. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Dr. Desai. You've probably seen her on online with Professor Hudson, Michael Hudson, I believe, right? Michael, I've got the name of Professor Michael Hudson, and they do a lot of good work on international economics and geopolitics. And today we've got a number of things we'd like to talk about. Dr. Desai, welcome to back to my humble YouTube, Rockfin, and Rumble channels.
Well, absolutely not humble, but great to be wherever you are, Garland. So,
no, thank you very much. Well, let's get started. Let's get started here. Brics. That's going on right now. We're here in the what is this, day 2? I think one more day of Brics. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Number of things that have happened. To me, the most. Some of the things that have happened on the sidelines have been quite consequential. Apparently, there's some hatchet burying going on with India and China over their border, which I think is a major consequence. I've read today that President Putin met with President Erdogan on the side. Your thoughts about the Brics and the importance of the things that are going on the sideline and around the Brics summit?
Well, I think Brics are an important barometer about how badly the West-led international order and the West-sponsored international arrangements are working. So as more and more countries are dissatisfied with it, they are expressing a greater and greater interest in the Brics. So in that sense, it is not surprising that the Brics have expanded from 5 to the present 10 including Saudi Arabia, whose status is not completely done, but it's more or less wrapped up. And we are told that there are 30 odd more countries that are more interested in joining. And all of these countries that are lining up to join are systemically very important. And that includes countries like Turkey. So, and you see, a country like Turkey has, of course, historically, like Russia, actually, in the past, looked to the West. Turkey has been in the antechamber of joining the European Union for decades. And I think that finally it is becoming recognized widely that the European Union is simply not going to admit Turkey. This was already problematic before, but now with the rise of far-right parties whose rise is in a very important respect powered by racism and Islamophobia, they are simply not going to admit a country which, upon admission, upon becoming a member of the European Union, will be not only the biggest country in the European Union, just slightly larger than Germany, but it will be a Muslim majority country, and it will be regarded as a non-white country, although, as I say, in my humble opinion, whether Turks are white or non-white remains a moot question, but that's another matter altogether. They're regarded as so let's just leave it there. So I think that these are very and Turkey, of course, historically has seen itself, because it is, Turkey has a remarkable location. As you know, it straddles east and west. It is kind of like Eurasia, really. It is, on the one hand, home to many of the classic sites of ancient Greek civilization. On the other hand, of course, it is part of the Islamic non-West, and so on. So in that sense, it straddles many worlds. It is at the crossroads of many worlds. And in that sense, historically, Turkey has seen itself, it was neutral during the Second World War. It was trying during that time to keep a balance between the Soviet Union on the one hand and the West on the other, and Germany in yet another hand. So in that sense, and to some extent, this continues. So while being a member of NATO, this will be a remarkable first. While being a member of NATO, Turkey is basically indicating that it wishes to join the Brics. Of course, exactly how the BRICS go forward, or what are the criteria that are created to admit new members. We will have to see how it all goes in the future.
One of the things that makes me think about is it seems to me that in the new Cold War, I guess. I don't know how new it is. It's just a continuation of the Cold War. The US empire seems to be saying to the world, pick one side. It's either the US imperialism or the Eurasian, I'll say, Eurasian led economic bloc, the Eurasian led diplomatic bloc, etc. Right. And the US is saying, pick one. And there seems to be, take the UAE, there seems to be even Turkey, countries that want to go back to say, the non-aligned movement of the Bandung kind of conference thing. They want to be non-aligned. So it seems to me that the US saying, pick a side, and the countries that are saying, now we want to be have some kind of a modern day non-alignment movement in of itself is a rejection of American imperialism, because they're saying you don't have the authority to even tell us to pick a side. You say we must pick a side. We say you don't have the authority to that. We won't pick a side, and you can't force us to. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so exactly. So the Western, people say that the West, wants to, or let me start again. The West is complaining about the crisis of multilateralism, right? Everywhere
Right.
you look, there is a crisis of multilateralism, but this is in many ways a misnomer. Multilateralism basically means that you have to negotiate with other countries on an equal basis, on an equal footing. You negotiate on the basis of mutual respect for equal sovereignty, allow every country to pursue their own path and make agreements based on mutual benefit. That's what multilateralism means. And multilateralism, at the end of the Second World War, thanks to the existence of the Soviet Union, the existence of the soon-to-be People's Republic of China, and of course the decolonization that was essentially forced upon the imperialist countries by the rise of nationalist movements everywhere. And one should also add, of course, that there was a generally progressive mood at that time, because working class people in all these countries were also highly mobilized. They had been mobilized by their own ruling classes and asked to go and fight for their countries and die for their countries. So then they had the right to turn around and say, all right, you've asked us to go and fight for our countries and die for our countries. What is our country going to do for us in return? So all of these things meant that the West had essentially, Western countries, while they had considerable power, it was also very limited. Just to give you one example, the West, of course, compromised the principle of multilateralism in the United Nations, where in the General Assembly, every country had one vote. But the compromise was that in the Security Council, 5 countries had permanent membership of the Security Council with a veto. But guess what? Even there, the West's desires were not completely fulfilled. They had to accept within those 5 the Soviet Union and eventually China, although for the first couple of decades they kept China out by giving that seat to Taiwan. But that's another matter altogether. But what I'm saying is that on the one hand, the West had to accept multilateralism, which it tried to corrupt as much as possible. And the West, in pursuit of its own interests, it did not get its own way. And what we've seen more recently is, and this kind of continued, and there was, you referred to the non-aligned movement. There were a whole series of meetings and gatherings and initiatives that were taken in the post-Second World War period, where the Third World was increasingly getting organized, insisting on its own rights. So you had the Bandung Conference, you had then the creation of the Group of 77, you had the inauguration of a very interesting arm of the United Nations system, the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And that was really meant to be a think tank for the third world countries that would essentially put forward ideas for economic policy and so on, and international institutions and policies and so on, that would be conducive to third world development. There was also, of course, finally the demand for the new international economic order. So all of this culminated in that demand. And in the 1970s, which were in many ways quite similar to the point we are at right now. That was 50 years ago, but there were similar sort of protectionist pressures, third world assertion pressures, and all of that. So we've had all that. And so all of this shows that the West. Oh, okay. And one final thing. Sorry, I'm kind of taking a long time, but one final thing I will say, which is that so after this peak in the 1970s, there seemed for 2 decades as though the West had counterpunched and won. That is to say, we got 2 decades of structural adjustment. The third world debt crisis, the structural adjustment, IMF imposed policies, which were essentially the opposite of what genuine development needed. And these were imposed on third world countries. There was economic retardation in many of them. But all of this began to turn around in the new century because this moment of Western reassertion remained very brief. So once again, the West has been set back. And one of the key reasons why the West is set back is because actually it is pursuing a policy which is privileging the interests of its own corporations. So this is not in the interest of its own people, and it is not in the interest of the rest of the world. But Western governments are captive of those big corporations, and this does not suit the rest of the world. So you are looking at we talk about a crisis of multilateralism, but actually it's a crisis of Western power. It is a crisis of Western imperialism. And what organizations like the Brics are doing is they are trying to create a truly multilateral world system in which even the compromises that the West was able to achieve earlier, that impose earlier, do not have to be made. And we'll see how it goes.
Now, the deal between Russia and China, in your opinion, is that, was it window dressing? Does it look good? Or my feeling all along for some time was that Russia was working to get this done, that they felt it was critical because of course, they have strong relations with both of them, historical relations, particularly with India, but there's this enmity there. And that's 2.5 billion people that if they could get that together, that brings the Eurasian continent together and makes it very hard. That throws a monkey wrench in the Quad, a lot of things going on. Your thoughts, is this real change? What are your thoughts on the significance of the India-China so-called rapprochement?
Sure. I mean, I think that obviously you are absolutely right. The Russians have a great interest in promoting rapprochement between these two countries. And I would say that China has also historically tried to essentially make nice with India, but it has suffered from various problems. I would say that what has been achieved right now is limited but significant. So it is not huge. It is just a question of essentially ensuring that there are no border clashes. Fine, that would be a good start. How we go forward really depends on the attitude the Indian government takes. And it seems to me that the Indian government has a great interest in keeping an anti-China rhetoric and an anti-China policy going, because the government is not particularly popular. You've seen that it's taken a drubbing in the recent election, and generally speaking, it pursues a neoliberal policy, which is moreover profoundly divisive, hate-filled, particularly against Indian Muslims. So there is a huge problem with all these things. So, and also always bear in mind that this government, the BJP, which is a part of the BJP party, this government and particularly this prime minister are among the most pro-US forces that you can have in the Indian political system. So historically, they have pursued a closeness to the United States. And of course, in the process, they have also pursued a closeness to Israel. So, whereas historically, India has always stood by the Palestinian cause, the advent of BJP governments, BJP-led governments, beginning in the late 1990s, did change that to a considerable extent. So I would say that I would regard all these moves with hope, but also caution. I hope they will succeed, and I feel that although their inclination is very much towards the US, the possibilities for India are much more limited because the US has very little to offer to India. And of course, as you know now, more recently, there has been a new spat between India on the one hand and the US and Canada on the other. So all of these things may mean that the situation may be more propitious for an India-China rapprochement, but I would still regard all these things with great caution. And one final point, in order for there to be a true rapprochement between India and China, the character of the political discourse in India needs to be changed. The government needs to be more frank with the Indian people about what is the purpose, and also, why has India been so anti-China in the past? Because if you've been so anti-China in the past, how are you going to explain this sudden rapprochement? They have to come clean that they have been taking certain unreasonable positions, that it is time to change those positions. You can do it as delicately as you like, but you're going to have to do something like that for there to be lasting rapprochement between India and China, which I think there can be. And also, given that China today has so much more to offer than the declining West, is only going to make that more inevitable, but it's still going to be one painful step at a time, I'm afraid.
Which brings us back to Brics, because we can refer to Brics as a crisis of imperialism, and I also refer to it as a crisis of neoliberalism. Which, of course, is that imperialism. What terms do we use to describe this crisis are moot. We've got the crisis, you're irrelevant. But, and looking at this, so we have this crisis of imperialism and neoliberalism. I guess that you have to separate them, because to me, neoliberalism is more internal and expansive, where imperialism is, we go all the way back to Lenin and talk about that forever. But at any rate, countries that have a neoliberal leaning or bend, such as India, right, being in Brics, and at the same time aligning with countries that are clearly anti-imperialism to the core now, and countries that at some point, that to some extent are victims and in the crosshairs of the imperialists, such as Russians, such as some of the African countries that want in, Venezuela wants in, Iran. We've got some hairy issues that are going to have to be stepped upon lightly. This is going to take some really good diplomats and people. Your thoughts on that? You got Iran, Turkey, India, Russia. The U.S. empire is probably, they're foggy bottom. They don't know which way to turn. Your thoughts on this kind of weird crisis that we have with, say, a Russia and a China? See, meanwhile, though, you've got Russia and China, these massive commodity and industrial powers there to anchor this thing. Anyway, your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, so first of all, let me say that the partnership between Russia and China is the most important partnership in the Brics, and it is going to determine the future of the Brics. And I'm afraid, much as Brazil or India or South Africa may wish for something else, they are not going to get it. Because as I say, the objective situation is that the West has very little to offer. And all the offers at the moment are in the pockets of the Russians and the Chinese, as you say, the one being a massive manufacturing power, the other being a massive resource power. And they're not going to go away. And they are now aligned with one another. There's a couple of other things I wanted to say. I want to first comment on the Iran situation, because I think it's very critically important. And then I want to say something really more about the crisis of imperialism and neoliberalism. So first of all, Iran, this is the first summit after Iran was finally admitted. So they have all the 5 new countries have been formally welcomed into the Brics. And the presence of Iran is very important. And obviously it would have required all the 5 countries to agree to admit Iran. But now that Iran is there, and remember, when Iran was admitted, October the 7th had not happened. Now it has happened. And I think that it would be really interesting to see, and I haven't had the time to look at the statement yet. Maybe we'll discuss it the next time we are talking. But what exactly the statement says about Iran, the Gaza situation, the Lebanon situation, the Houthi situation, all of this will be critically important. And I would say that, and of course, both Russia and China have reason to be careful on the Iran situation. On the one hand, I don't think they're going to give up on Iran. They are going to back Iran. But at the same time, like Iran, they do not wish to provoke any unnecessary escalation. So it's going to be, like you say, very, very fancy diplomatic footwork is going to be necessary. So that's the first thing. And I expect there to be full backing of Iran, but without being escalatory, etc. Now,
Controlling the escalation. That's what I always say. As
exactly.
long as Iran and its allies control the rate of escalation in the Middle East, they have control of the situation. Oh, that Belt and Road stuff runs through there. Everything. They can't have that get out of control. And I'll add this. And the U.S. empire probably would love some chaos in that area to throw a monkey wrench in Brics and in the Belt and Road projects in that region.
But yeah, so exactly, and we agree on this. Now, I just wanted to, if you don't, with your permission, I'll get a tiny bit theoretical, because you did, after all, mention Lenin. This past summer, and this is the 2024 is the 100th anniversary of Lenin's passing. So there has been a certain amount of academic discussion of Lenin, inevitably. And so this past summer, I gave a paper in one of the conferences I was at, in which I basically said that Lenin was right about imperialism being the highest stage of capitalism. Now, why did I have to say that? People would say, well, don't everybody think so? Well, you see, actually, everybody doesn't. One of the sticks that people have used to beat Lenin with is they said, well, what did Lenin mean when he said back in 1916 that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism? Look at, after the Second World War, you get such a big boom of capitalism, and so he was clearly wrong, and so on. And I said, no. In my book, my recent book, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy, I have argued this, and I've also argued it in some other places. Essentially, and by the way, if you're interested, you can download this book from my website for free, because it's available open access thanks to a foundation. But anyway, the point I want to make is that what Lenin meant was totally in line with what Marx said. Marx basically said that once capitalism arrives at its monopoly phase, it's going to be ripe for transformation into socialism, because that's it. Once you get monopoly power only gives you the right to print money on the basis not of expanding production or increasing efficiency or productivity, but simply because you are a monopolist. Essentially, it is the gateway to rentier incomes, which are deeply illegitimate, and therefore people will wake up to this and they will transform the society into a socialist society. Well, unfortunately, this did not happen in the West. And so, what happened what happened instead was that there was a deep crisis, what I call a 30-year crisis of imperialist wars, the Great Depression, a tremendous weakening of imperialism because of inter-imperialist wars and the rise of nationalist movements and so on. So imperialism has been declining all the way since. And the only reason you got the golden age of growth is not because of capitalism, but because of the reforms that were imposed as historical necessity on capitalism. So you essentially got the reforms with full employment policies, welfare states, substantial state ownership, heavy industrial regulation, progressive taxation, you name it. You got this whole slew of reforms which actually put capitalism on its best behavior. And yes, you got a golden age of growth because of those reforms. And then the moment neoliberalism began to push back on those reforms, what did you get? You got an era of slow growth, of stagnation. And so every neoliberal decade for the last 4.5 decades, you've had ever slower growth, ever slower investment in Western countries, ever greater financialization, ever greater outsourcing, so that the West, instead of being revived by neoliberalism, has been destroyed by neoliberalism. And that shows you that this is all capitalism is capable of. It was already 100 years ago ripe for transformation into socialism. It is so even more today. But there you go. So anyway, to make a long story short, neoliberalism, which is essentially the rolling back of those post-war reforms, is primarily responsible for the accelerated decline of the West, and therefore also the accelerated decline of its imperial power, essentially. And just one quick point, so that, when the Soviet Union ended, everybody thought the world would enjoy unipolarity and benevolent US leadership of a unipolar world, and they would enjoy a peace dividend. We have seen the opposite. Within less than 2 decades, people were talking about multipolarity, not unipolarity. And of course, within a few years, beginning with the wars in Yugoslavia, you have seen unremitting war. There has been no peace dividend. It's because imperialism is getting more and more desperate. Yeah.
Interesting. So let's we've talked a bit about BRICS. Let's move that right into NATO. We've got the conflict in Ukraine, right? And of course, it's obvious what the infamous Wolfowitz doctrine. The U.S. Imperialists say no one can rise to confront us, to challenge our authority, and particularly in the Eurasian continent. They have a good memory of the importance of the Eurasian, the history of the discussion of the importance of the Eurasian sphere. Nobody. So what do you know? As would be expected, up comes the Russian Federation again, and boom, we're in Ukraine and we're doing this thing again, where we got Russian tanks in the Kursk region. I mean, German tanks in the Kursk region once again. After I look at this, and I see no way NATO survives this. Yeah, I see no way out. We've got one of these. The Russians are on their border. They're not going to stop fighting, and they're going to win. Particularly in these instances, you're not going to go to the border of a superpower, on that superpower's border, I don't care who it is, and win. It's not going to happen. NATO has demilitarized themselves. If they wanted to go fight Russia, they don't have anything left to fight them with. And they have so infuriated their populations that if the ruling elite tried to drag their populations into war on Russia's border, they'd hang them. So at some point, Russia's, and they're coming up, they're talking amongst themselves saying, I've got a plan. We'll go to Russia and we'll say, we'll have a ceasefire so that we can then rebuild Ukraine up and attack you again in 5 years. And Russia's saying, we can kind of see what you're doing. The answer is no. I see no way in the long term that NATO survives, mainly because, if for no other reason, the crisis of neoliberalism, the crisis of imperialism going after Russia has created a dynamic where the people suffering at home say, and this is what we see in the US, we're having natural disasters, we're having economic pain, we're having inflation, and you're spending all of this money on war. They've created this dynamic where they need war to go after their adversaries and try to keep neoliberalism going. And they've created a dynamic at home where the people are sick and tired of war and are saying, we want money, as this happens in empires. Eventually, the people say, why are we suffering? And all the money's going to maintain the empire. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, this is such an interesting set of thoughts that you are pointing out. Now, first of all, I mean, there's a difference between NATO falling apart or whatever, NATO being not able to, really the question, I think I completely agree with everything you say. This is like the beginning of what? This is going to be very, very difficult for NATO. The question really is, how will the cookie crumble? Because, people seem to have some very odd and wrong ideas about NATO. So, you're right, they are going to be defeated. You are right, they do not have the productive capacity. Remember, wars are not fought on the basis of, of soldiers' bravery alone. They have to be supplied. They have to be supplied with ammunition. They have to be supplied with all the other equipment that they need. And the West's capacity to supply this stuff is denuded precisely for the reasons we were just mentioning. 45 years of neoliberalism have hollowed out Western productive economies. They are incapable of producing the things. Meanwhile, the Russians, which have never given up their capacity to produce, particularly not to given up their capacity to produce military equipment, they have their military industries are booming. They have to boom in order to continue this war. So anyway, so all of these things are correct. And of course, the groundswell of popular opposition to any kind of war, involvement with any kind of war with Russia is also there among ordinary people. And you have seen the election results in the recent past in various European countries that have not been particularly conducive to the Atlanticist elements of their ruling classes of these countries. Okay, but there's a further thing. NATO has never really been about coming to the aid of others. People think that moment you become a member of NATO, that if somebody attacks you, that you will be defended by all the NATO countries. No, I'm sorry. If you look at Article 5 says something very different. It says the following: the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in the exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the UN, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, and this is the important bit, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain. So if imagine I'm the leader of my country and I deem it necessary only to send 10 helmets to help somebody, as Germany originally did, I believe, that's fine. That's all the help I need give. Article 5 does not enjoin anything on any member nation. It simply says you will do whatever you do. What kind of an article is that? What kind of a collective defense article is that? And this is increasingly being talked about in policymaking circles where, the United States leaders, Garland, you belong to a truly great country because they have refined the art of saying one thing to the domestic constituency and another thing to the international community, so to speak. So to the domestic constituency, the American leadership is always saying, oh, no, we are not spending a single penny on these wars and Ukraine is going to have to pay it back and blah, blah, and so on, and other such things, and so domestically, what the American leadership will now increasingly start emphasizing is that if there were to be some kind of an escalation in Europe, the United States does not have to be involved. That's what they will emphasize. Meanwhile, to everybody else, they will say, oh, we all have to defend each other and blah, blah, and so on. So exactly how, so this kind of ramshackle NATO can continue in existence for a long time, precisely because it means nothing. So that's what I was saying is, when we say that NATO can't really survive anything, I mean, really, the only war that NATO has ever fought was Afghanistan, when Article 5 was invoked and everybody felt obliged to contribute something. But since then, there have always been coalitions of the willing anyway. So yeah, I mean, in that form, NATO can continue existing in a zombie format for a long time.
Now, that being said, I think there is an issue that I think in order to have this discussion, you have to talk about that, and that is the attack on Nord Stream. That, I believe, is, as Alexander Merkels likes to put it, a bomb with a long fuse. Knowing people from Germany, talking to people, everyone knows what happened. Everyone in Europe knows what happened. And that belies the argument that NATO is an organization that is there to defend European countries from the Russian hordes. They were attacked by a country. The argument that people like me made, and people probably like you, a lot of people have made, that Germany is not even a sovereign country, that it is an occupied colony of the United States government, the U.S. Empire, is pretty clear now, in that it's not the attack that demonstrated that. It is the response or the lack thereof and the assisted government cover-up by the government, the so-called government, the Vichy government of Germany. Your thoughts on the importance of the Nord Stream attack and the long-term, what you predict will happen as a result of that in Germany and beyond?
I mean, this is again such an important question. And I have to say that this is, as a preliminary, as a preface, let me just say two things. Number one, this phenomenon of German, particularly subservience to the Atlanticist cause, always, it's something that I keep thinking about, and I keep looking for more things to read to understand this and so on. Second thing I should say is that I am going to be in Germany in November. So it'll be interesting if we talk. I'm sure we'll talk after that. And I would love to report back on the atmosphere that I find, because I'm going to be among some progressive intellectuals, and it'll be interesting to see what their judgment is. And I always have many questions to ask my friends there. But let me answer your question directly now. So first of all, yes, Nord Stream is, I agree, a bomb with a long fuse. And that long fuse, we don't know when it will erupt, because, as you say, everybody in Germany knows what's going on. And in Germany, there are still not just ordinary people who recognize what's going on and are opposed to it. That is to say, opposed to to German subservience to a United States, which is actually undermining Germany in every possible way. And we have the proof. I mean, Biden in that press conference, remember saying, if we are going to take care of German reliance on Russian gas, we're going to make sure it doesn't happen. And sure, this is how they did that. So everybody in Germany knows that. And what's more, there is actually a section, I'm sure, of the capitalist class that knows what's happening and that wishes to take a different approach. And where is the proof of that? Actually, while Germany and Japan, the two defeated powers in the Second World War, were essentially defanged. They were not permitted to rearm constitutionally, although of course they do have armies in a different name, but whatever. And therefore they are particularly have been subject to US influence. But if you look at the history of German assertion of its own interests, it has not been completely lacking in such assertions. Even at the height of the Cold War, Willy Brandt, as the Chancellor of Germany, took the initiative of the so-called Ostpolitik, in which he said, I'm going to deepen Germany's trade relationships with Eastern Europe and with the Soviet Union, because they're next door. Why should I not do that? Why should I be cutting an arm and a leg off? Why should I not be taking an opportunity to have better relations with the countries that are around me? So he took that initiative. After the Soviet Union disintegrated, the Europeans together also seemed to be trying to find their way towards a common security policy. Remember, it was just after Maastricht and so on. So they were saying we should have a common security policy, and that was then kind of kiboshed by the American intervention in Yugoslavia and so on. And then in the new century as well, particularly after the election of Trump, remember Macron saying that NATO was brain dead and so on. And also, in the new century, Mrs. Merkel, this is really interesting, Angela Merkel's initiative to make Germany make nice with Russia, to make German industry benefit from Russia's cheap energy supplies, and so on. This was all part of a long-term plan. And what we are now seeing is that the United States' effort to destroy this plan, and the real issue is, how far will it succeed? Will the Germans essentially, have they already decided that they're going to commit suicide? Or will there be some fight back, either from the ordinary people or even a section of the capitalist class in Germany? We have to wait and see. That's how long the fuse is, and we'll have to see how it blows up and what it blows up.
Now, the UK, the country that you're intricately familiar with, that you spend a lot of time in. The other crisis we have here, and it's a crisis similar to the U.S. Once the neoliberals take over, the imperialists take over both parties. There's two parties here. Democrats, Republicans. There you have the Tories and the Labor. Okay, they've got them both, and they are the same party. And then the people in a position where our lives are a living hell, and they say we want change. Certainly. Oh, you want the conservatives have done a terrible job, horrible job. The last thing you want is the conservatives. Here's a change. Keir Starmer and the labor movement, right? Look at here's the new boss, same as the old boss, right? Okay, but the problem being now, as you predicted, it wasn't long before people woke up to realize that the new boss is just a new mask on the old boss. But what happens then? What happens when the people realize that they don't have a political option, when it's, okay, these are terrible? And I think intuitively, most Brits knew what they were getting, but they maybe crossed their fingers or they had no other alternatives. What happens next? Where are we now? What happens next?
Well, basically, where we are at the moment is that we're barely 100 days into the administration of Keir Starmer, in the government of Keir Starmer, and it is already stinking to high heaven of the worst forms of corruption. So on the one hand, you have Keir Starmer involved in this ridiculous scandal in which he is being exposed as having taken various freebies from certain exceedingly rich people, including one Lord Ali. And all these freebies are the most amazing things. So what is it like? The loan of a very grand flat, the gift of clothing. I mean, hello, don't you and I just buy our own clothing? Like, do we need somebody to buy our clothing? And generally in the British press, people are saying that Keir Starmer and his wife, because they had apparently both been accepting gifts of clothing, including in his wife's case, by the way, it is not a gift of clothing so much as a gift of the rental of clothing from some very highfalutin, high fashion designer, etc. Now, and people are saying, isn't this so tacky? But I think it's worse than tacky. I think politically it shows you that your government is led by a person who thinks it is so important to appear all nice and flashy and proper that to, in a certain sense, draw a sartorial line between yourself, who are part of this rich, highfalutin crowd with whom you rub shoulders, and all the riffraff who don't even have enough to eat and heat their homes, let alone buy fancy clothes. I mean, this is the kind of divide that, in the old days, in the post-Second World War period, when democracy seemed to function rather better, politicians dressed as much as they could like ordinary people. They didn't. Whereas now, I think you are seeing the hubris of the political class, that they want to dress like the richest people of the land, so that because that's who they generally hobnob with. That's who they hobnob with because that's who they take favors from. They give favors to that. That's who they take their orders from. So this is the kind of thing we're looking at. So that's the first thing I want to say. And this is these revelations are coming the day that the government announces that it is cutting some 150 to $200 or $300 that is given to senior citizens every winter in order to help with their heating costs. $200 or $300 per senior citizen. This is nothing. It's going to save the government $2 billion. The government is claiming that they need to save this $2 billion in all because the previous government has left them with a black hole of some $20 billion. And various fiscal critics have pointed out that, you could recover this alleged $20 billion that you thought you had and don't, by simply levying the lightest touch taxes on the rich. But they're not going to do that. They're going to take away this. And so you have these elderly people who are going to die this winter in large numbers because they are already presumably not such great health, and they will not have heating. On top of that, this government is keeping in place a limit on child tax benefit. So the child benefit will be given only for the first 2 children. If you have more than 2 children, you will not get it, which means they're pushing children into poverty. There are many other such draconian, I would say, policies, over the decades of neoliberalism, beginning with Tony Blair and continuing, of course, under Mrs. Thatcher, continuing under Tony Blair, under the Conservative government, etc., and now under Keir Starmer. The welfare state has gone. It is no longer a welfare state. It is not a way of redistributing a little bit of income from the rich to the poor. On the contrary, it has become a massive subsidy for rich people, because one of the ways in which it operates is that employers are allowed to pay you next to nothing, and when they do that, the state will give you just about enough to live a miserable existence, but it allows the employers to pay you less. So this is the kind of so-called welfare state. It's not welfare, it's a workfare state. Keir Starmer has also said that unless you can demonstrate that you're actively looking for work, you will lose your benefits. So this is the sort of thing that's happening. So this cannot continue for very long. This government has already lost its credibility. Its approval ratings are at a abysmal low. We have already pointed out. I wrote an article with a couple of friends, with my husband and another friend, when the election results were declared. Never has the government got such a big majority on such a tiny sliver of the vote. Actually, it is about 20% of the people, voting and non-voting, of the country that have voted for this government. This is not enough of a base. Basically, what happened is that this big majority of 174 seats, which is still less than Blair's majority, by the way, when the Tory vote was much better, but the Tory vote completely collapsed, and it had to after Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. I mean, what did you expect? So the Tory vote collapsed, and these people were the passive beneficiaries. They are doing nothing to endear themselves to the ordinary people. They are undertaking no significant policy that is truly popular. On the contrary, they are announcing one after another unpopular policies. So God knows what will happen. But whenever that end comes, there is no one to take their place. The Tories continue to remain in the wilderness. For a while, it looked as though they might elect some half-decent person as their leader and once again be in the running for a party favored by the establishment, but this is not going to be. Nigel Farage is waiting in the wings with his horrific anti-immigrant sentiments that can only create civil war in the country. So God knows what's going to happen, but it does not look good.
And that seems to me the case throughout Europe. Part of the crisis of neoliberalism is the political pushback from the masses. Look at France with Macron. He gets a so-called left. I mean, we call it something else, but what they consider a neoliberalism to be the far left, but they win. And he just says, I don't think so. And so
and appoints an extremely right-wing prime minister. I mean, it's ridiculous.
And,
while the people have voted left, he is appointing a right-wing prime minister.
And we were told that neoliberalism would give us more democracy. And now we're seeing that neoliberalism cannot possibly exist. Democracy cannot exist in the even medium to advanced stage of neoliberalism because it separates the government. I think that's the big thing we're seeing, a complete separation between the government policies and the people. Let me put it a different way. Who was it that said, was it Lenin? I don't know, that the government represents the ruling elite against the needs of the people. But they got to kind of fool the people to think that, okay. But instead, generally, they can kind of keep that fuzzy where the people are suspicious of it, but they can't really put their finger on it. We're now getting to a point where it's glaringly obvious to the people, and the government's position seems to be censorship.
Yes. This is such a true thing, and considering the way in which the West particularly regards itself as this paragon of virtue when it comes to like human rights and individual rights and so on and so forth, and always condemns China and Russia and so on as being somehow these authoritarian regimes that are going to take away your rights. The fact of the matter is that the spectrum of political opinion is much wider in China. I mean, I go very often to China, and I would say that the spectrum of opinion includes sort of neoliberals on the one hand and socialists on the other, and everybody in between. They are all part of the national conversation about which policies to undertake. But what we are increasingly seeing in the West is the suppression of opinions that are essentially critical, particularly on foreign policy issues. So you have seen look, I can understand, you can say that, on the issue, in the situation in Ukraine, Russia did attack some people may say Russia did indulge in an unprovoked attack on Ukraine, and somehow, therefore, you can justify criticizing Russia. And I mean, I don't agree with them, but I can see where they're coming from. Okay, but in Gaza, those who are standing up for the rights of the Palestinians, just not to be massacred, not to be subject to genocide. I mean, what is happening, so what is happening of course, for people who just point out what is happening in Gaza, that it is a genocide, that Israel's response has absolutely nothing to do with what happened on October the 7th. The hostages are the last of the priority of the Israelis. of the current Israeli government, this kind of thing is landing people into trouble. It is landing people into trouble of various sorts in their professions, in their, in their ability, even in their ability to get what they're saying published. The mainstream media is not buying it, so the night of censorship is upon us already, and we really have to speak up against it. I mean, I'm glad that the alternative media exists, because without that, we would be simply, we would know that we are being lied to, but we would have no alternative information.
And also the issue of Israel right now. There is a crisis there in. It is creating a major crisis. I'm pretty sure in Europe, but in the U.S., because the numbers are overwhelmed, and we see this crisis over and over again, right? And I think this is part of the crisis of neoliberalism. I could go policy after policy. The Democratic Party, I believe 88% of the people in the Democratic Party would like some kind of a national health service, right? The other 12% that rule the party says no. 70 to 80%, I think 70% of America, probably 90% of the Democratic Party want a cessation of hostilities in Gaza. And, they want the genocide to stop. Absolutely not. And in fact, it appears that that's going to be one of the significant factors that causes Kamala Harris to lose, because it's certainly really looking like she's going to lose. And the Democratic Party basically are in a position where, like, we'd rather lose. No. There's a significant crisis there, in that I think, my opinion, Israel is a cat's paw in the region. Israel is a military outpost of U.S. imperialism. Probably they consider the most important, because that's where all the oil is, and other geopolitical and geographical reasons. And now the empire seems so desperate that they're like, we can't lose that, but not just can't lose it. We can't lose the military and intelligence and economic domination that Israel has in the region. Bad news, they've already lost it. So there, again, we have an empire that's trying to hold on to a hegemony that they either never had or have already lost. Depending on how you argue it, it amounts to the same.
I couldn't say more, and I couldn't say it much better. I mean, this is exactly it. People say that the United States' unreasoning support for Israel is due to AIPAC, and I have no doubt that AIPAC is very powerful. But the United States is not just doing it because of that. The United States, as you say, it has always regarded Israel as its unsinkable aircraft carrier in the region. And it wants to hang on to it. The problem that it has is that today the burdens of being what the United States needs Israel to be in the region have brought it to the point where that state has essentially become kind of like crazed, you could practically say, because basically these people have to pursue a policy that they cannot win on. But nevertheless, they have no other way, both from the point of view of Netanyahu's own security of tenure in power, and from the point of view of what Israel can do in order to remain some kind of to be regarded as some kind of dominant power in the Middle East. Although, as you say, it has already lost that position. The fact that the incursions by Hamas on the 7th of October could take place already show you that the IDF had been asleep at the wheel, and that they had not been doing that job. And since then, I would say that Iran's ability to overwhelm the Iron Dome, I do believe that when we are told of, when we are told of the casualties on each side, it seems that at least on the side of Gaza and Lebanon and so on, there is some honest effort to try to report the casualties as they are. But on the Israeli side, I have a deep suspicion that they are underestimating their losses massively, because they can't afford to let ordinary Israelis know that. It seems that the ordinary Israelis somehow are still supporting them. They are pretty gung-ho about, raining destruction on Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, and so on. I can't imagine how. I'm sure there are many critical voices, but most people are behind the government. But they can only be kept behind the government if they don't realize how vulnerable they are. The moment they realize that if there is a war with Iran, they could suffer the same fate as the Palestinians in Gaza, it would scare me. It would if I were one of them. Imagine I was somehow deluded into believing what they believe. That would certainly give me pause.
Before we go, there is one other area that I think it's critical to talk about, and that is what's going on in Africa. We have certainly U.S. imperialism and its allies are fomenting, numerous conflicts in Africa, the Congo, Sudan, the UAE, there are all those things going on. But the return of the Russian Federation in its current iteration to its anti-imperialist roots in Africa, the growth of Ibrahim Traore and the Sankara kind of mentality, the Nkrumah thought, a kind of African pride that is coming, seems to be, with the Organization of Sahel States. Russia's ability to use its influence in Algeria to help those. Your thoughts on the importance of what's happening in Africa right now? I think it's critical. It isn't discussed enough.
I think that, first of all, what has the collapse of French power in what was French West Africa is obviously the big story of our time, in particular of recent times, but more generally for the last couple of decades, I would say at least. China has also, of course, been increasing its presence in Africa, and there have been many attempts on the part of Western powers generally, and the United States in particular, to incite various sort of liberal, educated African elites to essentially take an anti-China position, come up with all sorts of stories about debt trap diplomacy and, just casual conversation about how the Chinese are, say the Chinese rice is actually plastic. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, why would they? It doesn't make sense. But that's the sort of thing that educated people, Western-oriented people are ending up saying. But this is not carrying a lot of conviction. And so the presence of both Russia as well as China on the continent has certainly been displacing Western power. And that is not the least reason why American activities in the form of AFRICOM and so on are increasing. They're trying to keep hold of a continent that they thought was kind of exclusively theirs, and they suddenly realize that's not so. And I would say that this is just beginning, and this is a story that we have to pay a lot of attention to.
And lastly, it's interesting you say that, because one of the issues I think that is of great consequence is this. This is what the empire is dealing with. This particular empire, generally empires have a region of the world that they want to dominate. The U.S. wants to dominate the entire planet. And right now you have, what's his name? The guy in, what country is that? I met him in Venezuela, Bolivia, where they have all of the lithium. I believe it's.
Oh yes, Bolivia, Evo Morales.
Morales, yes. He's going to run again. He'll be back in power. Russia's going to build a lithium processing plant in there. Bottom line, here's my point. The U.S. just had got hit by a couple of hurricanes, and the people here are screaming, "My God, you're giving $8 billion over here, $2 billion, $600 million here," and people got their entire towns washed away, and you want to give them $750. It is very expensive to dominate the planet, and we come back to this dynamic again. It's so expensive. Imperialism is so expensive that it is driving the people here into absolute fury, and the so-called pink tide is rising again in Latin America. And it seems there is no way this time. I mean, what do? AFRICOM's they're fighting for AFRICOM, of extremely expensive war in the Middle East, extremely expensive war in you. I mean, two extremely expensive wars. I guarantee you this, they are hiding from the American people just how much it really costs to keep these two conflicts going, but yet they have to try to tamp down the people in Africa and Latin America. I think they're being driven into poverty, trying to maintain domination.
I couldn't agree more. And I'll just say one thing, and perhaps we can discuss this in greater detail in some future conversation. We are told by certain types of people who believe in things like modern monetary theory that the United States in particular can print as much money as it likes. Well, you know what? If that were true, then why wouldn't the United States please try to please everybody? Give not 750, give $750,000 to all the people who have suffered from the hurricane, while also giving Israel not just 8 billion, but 80 billion. Why not? The United States cannot do that. Yes, it did have a certain, to some extent, it has certain freedoms, but it is not a limitless freedom and of printing money. And that is why the dollar is essentially, it is basically heading towards another crisis, given just how indebted the American government has become. And that is why it's important for people to realize that they have to have they have to try to elect a government that is not going to pursue these imperialist policies, because that is exactly why the United States, because it is trying to control the rest of the world in the interest of a small number of rich Americans, it is failing to do its duty by ordinary Americans. And as long as it's trying to do the first, it is never going to succeed at the second.
Well, perfect timing. That is 1 hour and 10 seconds. So that's absolutely perfect timing. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Desai. Everyone can see there. You can go to rathikadesai.com. You'll see that right under just Dr. Desai's name. A lot of great information there. You can follow her good work. I believe, didn't you say they can download your book from there?
Yes, it's the PDF is free for anyone who wants it. You only pay if you want a paper copy. So there'll be a link there from where you can download Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy.
And there we have it. There you have it. Geopolitical. Yep, and all about, and there's lots of information there, as you can see. There we have our book.
That's the first book over there.
Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. I really want to talk to you about, we're going to have one where we talk about the whole coronavirus issue. I think that is very, very interesting, particularly from an economic perspective. But at any rate,
for me, Garland, this is very important for shows like ours or this one like yours to talk about, because unfortunately, bulk of the criticism of our governments of their coronavirus related policies came from the right.
Yes.
The left was basically absent, missing in action. So we have to really mount a critique from the left, what really should have been done for ordinary people to be protected, for there not to be profiteering on the part of big corporations, and a whole other slew of things besides.
Yeah, the questions we asked from the left were things like the question I asked: why is it that Walmart can be open with 1,000 people, but this little corner store that only has 4 or 5 people can't be open? Wouldn't it be better to have the small stores with a few people open than the large stores with thousands of all of these things? And in the decisions that were made with no scientific background, they just said, we're going to do this. Everybody has to do that. And later, at some point, we said, okay, was there a scientific foundation for it? Nah. And then mysteriously, those decisions just happened to benefit the wealthy. So, so maybe there was something behind it and it wasn't science. Exactly. Thank you very much, Dr. Desai. I look forward to talking to you next week, and I really appreciate it. Everyone, go to Dr. Desai's website where you can learn far more. And you have to read, everyone, before we get back, we talk to Dr. Desai next week. You have an assignment. The assignment is to be at least the first couple of chapters of Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy. Thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you.
Everyone, make sure you share this on all your social media platforms. As you know, I'm not on X, and these kinds of things are tamped down by YouTube and some of the other platforms. So I'm leaving it up to you to share this on all your social media platforms. Everyone, follow me on Rumble and Rockfin, just in case they do the unthinkable. Thank you very much, Dr. Desai. Everyone, we're out.